Hi everyone. If anybody's there, this is the sort of secret session. We've been using a bit of a music analogy as we go through, and this is the kind of the hidden track on the CD. Not really a formal presentation as such, just sort of a bit of a conversation. I'm not going to be taking questions or anything, but we'll post the video up and people can comment later if they'd like to. I just wanted to address the idea of deliberate practice because this is a really big thing in the expertise literature. I'm just going to post a link to the sort of seminal paper on this by Erickson et al. And really it's about, as I mentioned right at the beginning, the importance of learning and development importance of learning for the development of expertise. And I think it was something that Leo picked up in the previous session around this idea of having a systematic approach to development. I just want to talk about it and what it looks like in terms of teaching. Because Anders Ericsson, who's been sort of championing I should never try and say that word. He's been kind of he's sort of the godfather of deliberate practice, if you like, and he's been, if you Google it, he's the name that comes up. He's really interested now in identifying what does deliberate practice look like for different professions and fields, because he thinks that if you can characterize it, you can use that as a model to improve and develop expertise. And he's actually really accessible as a researcher, because I dropped him an email about this session, about this webinar and so on, and saying, we're looking into expertise, and he was really interested in that. Unfortunately, I was going to try and illustrate. I love using analogy, and I was going to illustrate this with reference to music, and particularly my banjo, which is sitting behind me here. Unfortunately, and this will probably save me time, I managed to slice my finger with when I was cutting some bread, so I can't actually play it at the moment. But I shall kind of talk about it. And the reason I want to mention the banjo is when I got my job at the University of West of England, I was offered a job 3 years ago. As a treat for myself, I said I'd get myself a banjo, with the proviso that I would practice what I preach and that I would deliberately practice. So what I'm going to do, and use what I've learned about deliberate practice in the literature and apply it to learning the banjo. Really interestingly, the teachers that I've had, both my sort of private teacher and in workshops, have also talked about deliberate practice. They haven't used that term, but the way they talk about intentional practice really relates to it. So, so as I said, I'm going to try and use it as an analogy. I think it's also something that's relevant to sports, crafts, hobbies, anything else. So if you've got other analogies, and apologies for not getting to hear the banjo. Maybe I'll do a little video and post it on the conference website for you. So one of the key features of deliberate practice is around repetition and time. I talked about this right at the beginning, and the idea of practitioners are people that repeat things in multiple situations. Practice doesn't necessarily make an expert. There's often a lot in the media about 10,000 hours of practice make an expert. Well, that's not the full story. I've played the piano since I was 4 years old. That's 4 years than I care to think of. I've probably clocked up a good 10,000 hours. I'm okay, but I'm certainly not a concert pianist by a very long way. I'm happy with that. When I play, I just play pieces, and if I get to a tricky bit, I'll just skip over it. If I'm learning something new, again, I'll tend to just play the bits I can play, and that's fine. It's okay for me. That's all I need. If I wanted to improve, if I wanted to develop, then I would focus particularly on the things I can't do, and I would practice those. And that's a sort of deliberate element of it. The other thing with music, and I think maybe with even with teaching as well, and my banjo teacher said this, is actually practice doesn't make perfect, it makes permanent. And the neuroscience kind of tells us this as well, in that you're fixing the sort of cognitive pathways in your brain, and that's fine if you're fixing it in the correct way. But if you've ever practiced something really hard and then discovered it's wrong, it's really difficult to undo and then relearn. So practice makes permanent. I've alluded before to the teachers who perhaps teach in the same way all the time and have done so for many years. I think the difficulty with that, it's fine if it works for you and if it works for your students. But if it stops working, or you've got to do something really differently, like in the COVID situation, and many of us had to change our teaching approaches, you don't have that flexibility. Whereas if you're used to developing and evolving your teaching, or practicing different things, or focusing on those things that don't quite work, when you have to change, you've got more kind of agility. So repetition and time are the important aspects of expertise. And I think for teaching, the time, there is that longevity. We do become better teachers with time. We develop that confidence, maybe more of that reflection in action and sort of improv and so on. We can come off script a bit more when we've had more experience. But the other key aspect of deliberate practice is feedback. We've talked a lot about this in the previous session, thinking about reflection. So you identify an aspect of your music or your teaching that you think needs improving. You're not going to look at the whole thing. You're going to just focus on a particular small bit. And again, in fact, I had this in my banjo lesson the other day. I sort of played through a piece that I'm working on, which happens to be a jazz piece, actually. My teacher said specifically that you can't quite get that chord change. Sorry, I'm illustrating with my fingers, but it doesn't really mean anything without the banjo in my hand. Rather than playing through the piece all the way, just stop and focus on those two different movements of your hand from this position to this position. Just go over that again and again and again. And then it will join into the rest of the piece. And so that's that deliberate focus. So similarly with teaching, reflect on a session. I think actually generally that was all okay, but there was this little bit that didn't quite work. So focusing on that little bit. But as I said, feedback is a really important part of it. What I've read in some of what I've read in expertise literature particularly focuses on feedback from a coach or a teacher or a mentor, of course from your audience as well, and also from listening. You can be your own coach just by listening and hearing where things aren't going quite right. I think what we've particularly been talking about this morning is actually feedback comes from lots of different places, and those multiple perspectives are really, really important. So feedback on self-reflection from your students, peer observation, it is fantastic. However experienced you are, peer observation, watching someone else or asking someone else to sort of watch you, and feedback is incredibly invaluable. So that's our other aspect of deliberate practice. So we've got the sort of identifying the thing to work on, repetition and time, feedback, and then the other part is motivation. Because actually that kind of deliberate practice where you're spending time on a focused thing can actually sometimes be quite boring, but also it can sometimes feel it's taking you away from doing what you want to do. Actually, I'd much rather just play that whole piece rather than focusing on the one bit. And I think this is particularly interesting for teaching in higher education, and I talk about this in my asynchronous video on development, because I think we conceptualise development and learning for teaching as a separate add-on activity. We're far too busy to do professional development. It's and when I talk to people who perhaps are writing an application for a Higher Education Academy Fellowship or something like that, and they're writing about their CPD, they tend to write it as a list of activities. An add-on is something different. But actually, it isn't something different. It is part of what you do. In order to teach effectively, you need to practice. You need to make little changes and tweaks and so on. And I think if you can conceptualize it as that, then the motivation becomes much more intrinsic because you don't see it as an add-on thing. It's just a part of what you do as a teacher. So, and I do like analogies a lot, and I use it. I particularly use music because I think that's really helpful. I also use running, sport, crafts, and so on. But think about what's meaningful for you in terms of understanding. And of course, we're talking about teaching. But I think the sort of final analogy that I'm going to make with music, which will sort of take us forward to some of the sessions this afternoon, is it's a bit like language learning. And again, this is something my banjo teacher was talking to me about quite recently, in that you construct it through little chunks. So you learn kind of little licks or maybe scales, or just a little way of doing things. You might learn them as part of a piece of music, but you will see them again and again in other types of music. So particularly in bluegrass banjo, which is what I mostly play, you start to recognise little things again and again. Oh, there's that little four-note run, or there's that chord progression, or there's that little twiddly bit you do. It comes up again and again. So you can construct your performance by, if you learn these little chunks, you can then start using them in different places. And as you become more experienced and more confident, you can start taking more risks. And perhaps you can kind of throw in a different little chunk of activity instead of the usual thing you do. And that, I think, is where you're also starting to improvise. Improvise isn't completely making it up as you go along, though sometimes it can sound like that. It's about building on what you're already doing, what you already know, and popping in things that are then relevant. And I'm sure a lot of us have done that in our teaching, where we think, oh, this activity isn't going very well. Actually, there's something else we could do instead. So kind of bringing in something else, another part of your repertoire, another riff that you have. I can't improvise on the piano because I've always learned with music. I'm always on script, and I can't come off script on the piano. That's just the way it is. I'm hoping that maybe one day on the banjo I will. I've only been playing for a couple of years, so might be a bit of time. But I think now I've got that analogy in my head and those ways of conceptualizing it, I think actually that kind of helps me to think about how I might learn and develop. I hope that's also the same for teaching. If we can help people to conceptualize what learning and development and expertise is like, it may become easier to embrace and to develop. So I'm conscious of time, and I'm going to finish there. Thanks very much for those who are listening and for some of your comments are coming through. And I shall give you a couple of minutes before we get restarted. Thank you.